two sisters, Azine and Amara, seemed like they were inseparable. They had grown up in the same home, shared secrets, and supported each other through life's ups and downs. But behind the closeness, an old, hidden truth was festering, slowly poisoning the relationship between the two. No one would have ever imagined that this deep-rooted secret would lead to a shocking tragedy. On a quiet evening in their hometown, everything changed. Azine's jealousy, fueled by years of suppressed anger, turned deadly. Amara, her bright and loving younger sister, was found dead, the victim of a crime that tore apart their family. What had started as simple sibling rivalry had spiraled out of control, with devastating consequences. The tragedy didn't end with the murder itself. When the police began to investigate, Chief Inspector Obi uncovered a long-buried family secret that lay at the heart of the sisters' relationship. As they dug deeper, the story of jealousy, betrayal, and heartbreak unraveled, leaving the entire community in shock. This is the story of how jealousy consumed one sister, leading to the death of another. It's a tale of hidden pain, unresolved anger, and the fatal consequences that can arise when deep emotions are left unchecked. This case will take you inside the minds of two sisters who loved and hated each other in equal measure. What led Azine to commit such a horrifying act? And what was the secret that drove her to murder? Stay with us as we unravel the details of this heartbreaking crime, piece by piece. Azine and Amara had always been close in their childhood. Growing up in a quiet neighborhood, they shared everything from their toys to their secrets. Azine, the older of the two, was always protective of her younger sister. Amara, with her carefree spirit, looked up to Azine as her guide. But as they grew older, the cracks in their relationship began to show. What started as a normal sibling rivalry slowly grew into something more toxic, and no one, not even their closest family members, could have predicted how it would all end. Azine was 35 now, a strong-willed and determined woman. Over the years, she had worked hard to build a stable life for herself. Amara, at 29, was the opposite, lighthearted and full of life. She had recently achieved success in her career and seemed to have everything going for her. From the outside, it looked like the two sisters had it all, but beneath the surface, resentment was brewing. Years ago, a family secret had come to light, one that neither sister could forget. It had been buried for so long, but when it surfaced, it changed the way Azine looked at her younger sister. She started to see Amara as a rival rather than her little sister, someone who had always lived in her shadow. This secret, never spoken aloud but always present, began to drive a wedge between them. What started as small arguments and disagreements eventually turned into long periods of silence, with Azine growing more bitter as time went on. In the months leading up to the tragedy, the tension between the two sisters had reached its peak. Azine, who had always been calm and composed, began to lose control. She couldn't understand why Amara seemed to have it all: success, love, and the admiration of those around them. For years, Azine had felt that she was the one who should have had those things. But life had dealt her a different hand, and she couldn't bear to see her younger sister succeed where she had failed. Amara, on the other hand, had no idea how deep Azine's resentment ran. She still saw her older sister as the person who had always taken care of her, and although they had their differences, she never thought it would lead to anything more than a typical sibling rivalry. She remained unaware of the growing danger as she focused on her career and personal life, moving forward while Azine's anger festered in silence. One evening, Amara invited Azine over for dinner, hoping to mend the rift between them. It was a small gesture, but Amara believed that they could work through their issues if they spent more time together. However, Azine had other thoughts in mind. Her jealousy had reached a point of no return, and she saw this as the perfect opportunity to confront her sister about the secret that had been haunting her for years. The dinner started off innocently enough, with the two sisters sitting together, laughing and reminiscing about old times. But as the evening wore on, Azine could no longer hold back her emotions. The conversation took a dark turn, and the buried secret came to the surface once again. The tension in the room was palpable as the argument escalated, with Azine's anger boiling over. She felt betrayed by her own family and blamed Amara for all the things she had lost in life. As the argument intensified, something inside Azine snapped. Years of suppressed anger and bitterness came pouring out, and she could no longer control her actions. In a fit of rage, Azine attacked her younger sister. The moment was brief, but the damage was irreversible. Amara, the bright, lively young woman, was left lying motionless on the floor of her own home. The family secret that had torn them apart now claimed Amara's life, leaving Azine to face the horrifying reality of what she had done. This was not just a case of sibling rivalry gone wrong. It was a tragic story of jealousy and unresolved emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. As the evening of the argument between Izin and Amara turned deadly, the reality of what had just transpired began to sink in. Izin stood frozen, staring at her sister's lifeless body on the floor. The rage that had consumed her moments before was now replaced by a sinking feeling of disbelief and regret. It was too late, her actions could not be undone. The sound of silence in the room was deafening. Izin's mind raced, but she couldn't process what had happened. She looked around the room, seeing the table where they had just shared dinner, the half-empty glasses, the uneaten food. This was supposed to be a reconciliation dinner, a chance to mend their broken relationship. Instead, it had ended in the most tragic way possible. Panic began to set in as Izin realized the gravity of what she had done. She had killed her sister. Her hands shook as she fumbled to reach for her phone, unsure whether to call the police or someone else. Her heart raced, and for a brief moment, she considered running away, leaving everything behind. But deep down, she knew there was no escaping this. She would have to face the consequences. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of her actions became unbearable. Izin's mind flashed back to the moments leading up to the tragedy of their argument, the secret that had resurfaced after all these years, and the bitterness that had been festering inside her. She thought about how different things might have been if only she had been able to control her anger. But now, none of that mattered. Finally, she dialed the police. Her voice was barely audible as she reported the incident. She felt detached from her own words, as if someone else was speaking through her. It wasn't until she hung up the phone that the reality of her situation hit her again. She would soon be surrounded by police officers, crime scene investigators, and flashing lights. The life she had known was about to change forever. When Chief Inspector Obi and his team arrived at the scene, they found Izin sitting on the floor, staring blankly at her sister's body. The officers moved quickly, securing the scene and taking Izin into custody. Obi, a seasoned investigator who had seen his fair share of tragedies, could immediately tell that this case was different. There was something deeply personal about the crime, something that went beyond the surface of sibling rivalry. As Obi began his initial investigation, he questioned Izin. She was in a daze, barely able to answer the most basic questions. It was clear that she was in shock, but Obi needed to piece together the events that had led to Amara's death. He noticed the signs of a struggle in the room, the overturned chair, the broken glass on the floor, but no clear motive yet. Izin's emotions were a mixture of fear, regret, and disbelief. She had spent years harboring resentment toward her younger sister, convinced that Amara had somehow taken everything away from her. Yet, in the moments after her sister's death, none of that seemed to matter anymore. All she could think about was how wrong she had been, how much she had lost, and how her life was now ruined beyond repair. Obi's investigation quickly led him to uncover the deep-seated jealousy that had built up between the two sisters. Neighbors and friends described their relationship as complicated, with frequent arguments and periods of estrangement. Some even mentioned the family secret that had torn them apart, though no one seemed to know the full details. What was clear to Obi was that this crime wasn't just a random act of violence, it was the result of years of tension that had finally reached a breaking point. The forensic team worked tirelessly to collect evidence from the scene, while Obi began to interview family members and friends. He was determined to understand the root cause of the tragedy, but the more he learned, the more complicated the story became. It wasn't just a case of sibling rivalry, it was a toxic relationship that had been slowly unraveling for years, fueled by jealousy, bitterness, and unspoken secrets. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Izina's actions were the culmination of years of unresolved conflict. Her jealousy toward Amara, combined with the resurfacing of the long-buried family secret, had pushed her to the brink. Now she was left to face the consequences of her actions, knowing that she had taken away the life of the one person who had once been her closest ally. As the investigation deepened, Chief Inspector Obi's team began uncovering details about the family dynamics that no one had known before. Izin's resentment towards Amara had been simmering for years, fueled by a combination of jealousy and unresolved tension from their childhood. Though the outside world saw them as two sisters who had simply grown apart, the truth was much darker. Izin had always felt overshadowed by her younger sister, Amara. Growing up, Amara had been the favored child, excelling in academics and earning the admiration of their parents and peers alike. Izin, on the other hand, struggled to find her own identity. As the elder sister, she had tried to be protective of Amara at first, but the constant comparison and pressure eventually broke that bond. Izine felt trapped in her sister's shadow, and over time her feelings twisted into something dangerous. The key to unlocking the motive behind the murder lay in a long-buried family secret that had resurfaced just days before Amara's death. During the investigation, Obi interviewed several close friends of the family and pieced together what had happened. The sisters had recently discovered the truth about their father, a truth their mother had hidden from them for years. Their father had lived a double life, secretly maintaining another family in a neighboring town. The revelation shattered the sisters' already fragile relationship. While Amara, ever the rational one, had taken the news in stride, Izine had seen it as another betrayal, this time from the very people who were supposed to protect her. She was furious at how easily Amara accepted the situation, and how, once again, her sister seemed to handle everything with grace while she crumbled under the weight of it all. In Izine's mind, it wasn't fair. Nothing had ever been fair. Obi knew that emotions like jealousy and anger could lead people to make terrible choices, but the depth of Izine's resentment shocked even him. He and his team worked diligently to gather evidence, including texts, emails, and diary entries from both sisters. It became clear that the argument on the night of the murder wasn't just about the family secret, it was about years of suppressed emotions finally boiling over. The night of the murder, Amara had confronted Izine about her growing bitterness. She wanted them to talk things out, to heal the wounds that had festered for so long. But instead of reconciliation, the discussion quickly escalated into a shouting match. Amara's calm, composed demeanor only fueled Izine's anger. She snapped, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy glass vase, and in a moment of blinding rage, struck Amara. The blow had been fatal. As Obi's team pieced together the events leading up to the crime, it became evident that Izine had not planned to kill her sister. It had been a crime of passion, one born out of years of unresolved pain. Yet that did not change the fact that she had committed murder. There was no turning back for her now. Back at the station, Obi sat across from Izine, watching her closely as she recounted the events. Her voice was hollow, devoid of the rage that had driven her to commit the crime. Now, all that remained was guilt. She couldn't take back what she had done, and she knew it. The once proud, bitter woman was now a shell of herself, crushed under the weight of her actions. Izine's confession was enough to secure her arrest, but Obi couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more tragic than most. The circumstances had forced him to reflect on how easily emotions could spiral out of control. The tension between the sisters had been palpable, yet invisible to those around them until it was too late. The tragedy of it all weighed heavily on Obi as he filed his final report. Amara had lost her life to the very person who should have loved and protected her most. And Izine, once full of anger, was now destined to spend her remaining days consumed by guilt and regret. It was a crime born out of the complexities of family, jealousy, and years of buried resentment, a crime that had destroyed 2 lives in an instant. The investigation continued as Obi's team prepared for the trial, where Izine would face justice. For Obi, this case would serve as a grim reminder of how even the closest relationships could hide deadly secrets. There was no redemption in this story, only the harsh reality that sometimes the deepest wounds come from within our own families. As the investigation continued, the pressure on Chief Inspector Obi and his team mounted. Every clue they found only deepened the mystery behind the strained relationship between the 2 sisters, Amara and Izine. What had initially appeared to be a simple case of sibling rivalry had now become much more complex, with hidden layers of jealousy, betrayal, and a long-buried family secret that had been unearthed just before the tragic murder. The discovery of the family's secret about their father, who had led a double life and fathered children with another woman, had shattered the delicate balance between the sisters. Amara, always the more composed and rational of the two, had processed the information with surprising calm. Izine, on the other hand, saw this revelation as another betrayal in a long line of injustices she felt she had suffered throughout her life. Chief Inspector Obi found himself reviewing pages of diary entries and text messages exchanged between the sisters, trying to understand the depth of the emotional conflict. It was clear that Izine had harbored feelings of inadequacy for years, always feeling overshadowed by her younger sister. These emotions had been simmering beneath the surface, slowly boiling over until they reached a breaking point. Izine had always been the quieter, more reserved of the two, while Amara was outgoing and confident. No one had seen this coming. As they delved deeper into the investigation, it became clear that Izine's actions had not been premeditated. The murder was a crime of passion, fueled by years of unresolved pain and jealousy. There were no signs of planning or forethought, just a moment of uncontrollable rage that had spiraled out of control. In the days following the murder, Izin had become increasingly withdrawn. She refused to speak to anyone, not even her own family. Her guilt was evident, but the legal process had to take its course. She was arrested and charged with the murder of her sister, and her trial was set to begin within a few months. As Obi prepared for the trial, he couldn't help but wonder if things could have turned out differently. Could the sisters have reconciled if they had addressed their issues earlier? Was there any way to have prevented this tragedy? These were questions that would likely remain unanswered, but they weighed heavily on his mind. The trial itself was a somber affair. Izin, looking gaunt and broken, barely spoke during the proceedings. Her defense team argued that the murder had been a result of temporary insanity, that she had acted in the heat of the moment and had not intended to kill her sister. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, one of years of resentment and jealousy that had finally culminated in a violent outburst. As the trial progressed, more details about the sisters' relationship came to light. Friends and family members testified about the growing tension between them, how Izin had always felt inferior to Amara, and how the revelation about their father had pushed her over the edge. It was clear that this was not a simple case of sibling rivalry, but a deeply rooted emotional conflict that had festered for years. As the trial of Izin reached its final days, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. The tragic murder of her younger sister, Amara, had not only shocked their close-knit family but the entire community. What had started as an argument between siblings had escalated into a deadly confrontation, leaving everyone asking the same question: how did things go so terribly wrong? During the closing arguments, both the defense and the prosecution presented their final interpretations of the events. The prosecution painted a picture of jealousy and long-standing resentment, arguing that Izin had been harboring ill feelings toward her sister for years. They emphasized that Izin's violent outburst was the culmination of years of emotional suppression. They pointed to the incriminating evidence, including the knife found at the scene, covered in Amara's blood, and Izin's own confession, made in a state of shock, just hours after the murder. The defense, however, took a different approach. They argued that Izin's actions, though undeniably tragic, were not premeditated. They spoke of a woman pushed to the edge, overwhelmed by the sudden discovery of her father's secret life and the emotional turmoil it had caused. They argued that Izin had snapped under pressure, acting out of momentary insanity, and that she had never truly intended to harm her sister. Izini sat in silence as the court proceedings continued, her face pale and drained of emotion. The weight of her actions seemed to press down on her as she listened to the arguments about her life and the devastating consequences of one uncontrollable moment. Family members and friends had taken the stand throughout the trial, some speaking in her defense, others recounting the growing tension between the sisters. The court psychiatrist had also been called to testify. He spoke about Izin's fragile mental state, explaining how the stress of her family's dysfunction, combined with feelings of inadequacy, could have contributed to her losing control that night. According to the psychiatrist, Izin had likely suffered from years of repressed emotions, all of which came crashing down when she learned about her father's hidden family. But the prosecution wasn't swayed by this argument. They reminded the jury of the facts. Izin had taken a knife and stabbed her sister in a fit of rage. Whatever emotions she had been feeling, it did not excuse her from the consequences of her actions. The final day of the trial arrived, and it was time for the jury to deliberate. The courtroom was silent as the judge gave instructions to the jury, reminding them that their decision should be based solely on the evidence presented. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Izin was found guilty of second-degree murder. While the court acknowledged that the act had not been premeditated, they ruled that Izin's actions were deliberate and that she must face the consequences. The sentence was delivered minus 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. The verdict brought some closure to the family, though it left a lingering sadness that no sentence could ever truly resolve. Amara was gone, and Izin would spend the next several years behind bars, separated from the family she had once been a part of. The courtroom was filled with tears as family members embraced one another, grappling with the reality of what had just unfolded. As Izini was led away in handcuffs, her eyes remained downcast, avoiding the gaze of her remaining family members. Her life had changed forever in the blink of an eye, and there was no undoing what had been done. The reality of her actions would haunt her for years to come, as would the memory of her sister, whose life she had taken in a moment of blind rage. Chief Inspector Obi, who had led the investigation, watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom. He had seen many cases like this before, cases where family disputes spiraled out of control, leading to unimaginable violence. But this case had struck a chord with him. He had grown up with siblings himself and understood how close and how fragile those bonds could be. As the courtroom emptied, Chief Inspector Obi reflected on the tragedy of the situation. Two sisters who had grown up together, shared childhood memories, and once loved each other deeply, had been torn apart by a mixture of jealousy, resentment, and emotional instability. It was a stark reminder of how unchecked emotions could lead to irreversible consequences. Outside the courtroom, reporters had gathered, waiting for statements from the family and legal teams. The media had followed the case closely, capturing the public's interest from the moment the murder had occurred. But for the family, the trial was just another painful chapter in a story that had no happy ending. As the news of the verdict spread, the community mourned the loss of Amara, a bright and loving woman whose life had been cut short in a senseless act of violence. Azin's imprisonment was little consolation, as the family would never be the same again. In the weeks following the trial, the family tried to pick up the pieces, but the damage was done. Azin's absence was felt deeply, and Amara's memory lingered in every corner of their home. The once strong bond between the remaining family members had been shattered, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. As for Chief Inspector Obi, he filed the final reports on the case and moved on to his next investigation, though the tragedy of the two sisters stayed with him. It was a case he would remember for years, a reminder of the delicate balance that existed within families, and how quickly that balance could be destroyed when emotions were left unchecked. The story of Amara and Azin would serve as a cautionary tale for many, a tragic example of how jealousy and resentment could lead to destruction. And though justice had been served, the true cost of the crime would be felt for years to come, not only by Azin but by everyone who had known and loved the sisters.